She set him up to fail, in front of the entire class. But when he solved a problem that even graduate students struggled with, the entire room saw her in a whole new light. The lecture hall at the University of Michigan hummed with the usual morning chaos. Students flipping through worn-out notebooks, tapping away on laptops, murmuring about assignments they barely understood. It was just another Tuesday in Professor Linda Cartwright's advanced calculus class. A class infamous for two things: its brutal difficulty and Cartwright's brutal teaching style. She wasn't just a professor, she was a force: sharp features, silver-rimmed glasses, a stare that could make even the boldest students shrink in their seats. If you wanted to pass her class, you had to earn it. No shortcuts, no sympathy, no second chances. And today, she wasn't in the mood for nonsense. With a click of her heels, she strode to the front. In one swift motion, snap, the chalk broke between her fingers. The room fell silent. "All right," she said, brushing a stray blonde hair from her face. "Last lecture, we covered multivariable limits. Today, we move forward. Laplace transforms." She turned to the board and began writing. Equations spilled across the surface in perfect script. Numbers, symbols, complex formulas. Students scrambled to keep up, some lost, some pretending to understand. Cartwright thrived in this environment. The struggle, the pressure, the silent competition. She knew most of them would flounder. And she preferred it that way, because in her world, only the truly gifted deserved to be here. At least, that's what she thought. In the middle of the hall, one student sat quietly. No panic, no frustration. If anything, he looked bored. His name? Daniel Reed. Tall, lean, always in a hoodie and jeans, the kind of student that blended into the background. He rarely spoke, never made a scene, but beneath that quiet demeanor, his mind worked faster than most. Numbers, patterns, equations. They made sense to him in a way they didn't for others. As he scanned the board, something caught his eye. A mistake. Small, subtle, but still a mistake. He hesitated. He could let it slide. No one else seemed to notice. But if she caught it later, she'd have to backtrack and waste time. Before he could decide, another student raised a hesitant hand. Professor Cartwright, I think there's an error in the second line." Silence. Cartwright turned slowly. One eyebrow arched. "An error," she repeated, her voice sharp. She scanned the board, then smirked. "There is no error. Flat, cold, final." The girl's face turned red. She dropped her gaze, embarrassed. Daniel exhaled sharply. He hated this. Professors who dismissed students, who acted like they were above making mistakes. And before he could stop himself, his hand was in the air. "Actually," he said, voice calm, steady, "there is an error." A ripple went through the room. Heads turned. Cartwright's expression didn't change, but for a split second, there was something in her eyes. Irritation. "Oh," she crossed her arms, "enlighten me." Daniel stood, not out of arrogance, not to make a scene. He just hated speaking from his chair. "It's in the second step," he said, pointing at the board. "You applied the transformation to the wrong term. The coefficient doesn't carry over that way. If you solve it using your method, the final answer won't match." Silence. Cartwright's jaw tightened. She turned back to the board, eyes scanning her own work. And then, there it was, the mistake. Her grip on the chalk tightened. For a moment, Daniel thought she might just admit it and move on. But then, her lips curled into a tight smile. "Well, Mr. Reed," she said, turning to him, "since you seem so confident, why don't you come up here and show us the correct way?" A few students chuckled under their breath. Daniel heard the unspoken challenge beneath her words. She didn't want to acknowledge that he was right. She wanted to put him on the spot, make him hesitate, make him stumble. But that wasn't going to happen. Daniel set down his notebook, walked calmly to the front of the room, and took the chalk from her hand. He wasn't going to hesitate, but Professor Cartwright had no idea what she had just set in motion. Daniel stepped up to the board, chalk in hand. The weight of the room pressed in, silent expectations hanging in the air. The professor's gaze drilled into his back. The quiet murmurs of students whispered through the lecture hall. Was he about to make a fool of himself? He could feel it, the anticipation, the doubt. But he wasn't nervous. With smooth, deliberate strokes, he erased the mistake and rewrote the equation. His handwriting wasn't as neat as Cartwright's. It didn't matter. What mattered were the numbers. And now, they lined up perfectly. He spoke as he worked, his voice calm, steady. The mistake was in how the transform was applied. A pause. You carried the coefficient outside too early, which changed the integral limits. But if you solve it this way, it keeps the function intact. The room was silent. No shuffling, no whispers. Only the soft scratch of chalk against the board. He finished the equation, set the chalk down, stepped back, then he turned. Cartwright stood rigid, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't used to being corrected, especially not in front of a packed lecture hall. Daniel saw it in her eyes. She wanted to dismiss him, find a way to twist the situation, make herself still look right. But instead, she took a slow breath, a curt nod. "Fine," she said. "You corrected it. Congratulations, that was it. No acknowledgement, no real praise, just fine." Some students exchanged glances. A few scribbled notes, pretending not to care. Daniel didn't need her approval. He returned to his seat, ignoring the lingering stares. Some were impressed. A few were irritated. Probably the ones who thought he was showing off. But he wasn't. He just couldn't stand errors, especially ones that could have been avoided. Cartwright turned back to the board. She wiped away his work. "Let's move on," she said briskly. Then, without warning, "Since Mr. Reed is so eager to contribute, I assume he won't mind another challenge." Daniel blinked. "Excuse me." But she was already writing. This time, it wasn't a simple equation. It sprawled across half the board, filled with integrals, limits, and a particularly nasty differential component. She finished the last symbol with a flourish, then turned to face him. "Since you have such a keen eye," she said, voice smooth. "Solve this." A few students shifted in their seats. Daniel stared at the equation. He knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't a regular class problem, not for this level. The sheer complexity made it clear. She didn't expect him to solve it. She expected him to hesitate, to fumble, to realize he was in over his head. She wanted to prove a point, to put him in his place. Daniel exhaled through his nose. "Fine." He stood up, walked back to the board. A few students chuckled under their breath. They thought he was about to embarrass himself. Cartwright smirked, arms folded. "Take your time," she said. Daniel didn't need time. He picked up the chalk and started writing. No hesitation, no second-guessing, just solving. Every symbol, every number flowed from his mind to his hand effortlessly. He didn't pause, didn't even need to think. His brain was already 5 steps ahead. The murmurs in the room faded. The lecture hall grew quiet. Professor Cartwright's smirk disappeared. Halfway through, Daniel glanced at her. "I assume you want the solution in terms of exponentials instead of trigonometric functions?" She didn't answer. He kept going. A few more steps, a few simplifications, and then, done. He underlined the final answer, turned, casually set the chalk back on the tray. Silence, a deep, consuming silence. Then, somewhere in the back, a single student let out a low whistle. Cartwright's expression was frozen. She scanned his work, line by line, looking for an error, anything she could use to dismiss it. There was nothing. He hadn't just solved it. He had solved it elegantly, clean, efficient, undeniable. A few students whispered. Others leaned forward, now realizing what had just happened. Daniel crossed his arms. No smile, no gloating. He was just waiting. Finally, Cartwright spoke. Her voice, tighter than before. "Lucky, guess?" A few students laughed under their breath. Not at Daniel, at her. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "It wasn't a guess." Cartwright exhaled sharply through her nose. "Sit down, Mr. Reed." Daniel turned and walked back to his seat. And as he did, he could feel the shift in the room, the way people were looking at him now, some with admiration, some with resentment, and one person, Professor Cartwright, with something else entirely. But she wasn't done with him yet. The energy in the room had shifted. Daniel could feel it. No one was looking at Professor Cartwright the same way they had at the start of class. He hadn't set out to embarrass her. That wasn't the goal. But he wasn't about to shrink just to make her comfortable. Cartwright turned back to the board. Her grip on the chalk was tighter now. She continued the lecture. But something was off. Her words lacked the same authority. Then, without warning, she stopped mid-sentence. She turned. Her eyes scanned the rows of students before locking onto him. "If you're so confident, Mr. Reed," she said, forcing a smile, "how about we raise the stakes?" A few students chuckled. Others leaned forward. They could feel it. Something was about to go down. Daniel didn't react. "What do you mean?" Cartwright walked over to her desk, pulled out a thick textbook, flipped through the pages, past the sections they had covered, past the sections they were supposed to cover, before stopping. She turned the book around. The class stared at the dense equations sprawled across the page. Graduate-level material. Cartwright tapped the problem with her fingernail. "This," she said, voice smooth, "is from an advanced course. Something I wouldn't expect any undergraduate to be able to solve." A murmur rippled through the room. Some students frowned, others smirked. They knew what this was. A challenge. Cartwright tilted her head. "But since you seem to have a natural talent for this, why don't you prove it?" She smiled, but her eyes were sharp. Daniel exhaled slowly. He could see exactly what she was doing. This wasn't about math anymore. She wanted to break him, push him past his limit, make him struggle in front of everyone. Maybe he'd hesitate. Maybe he'd fumble. Then she'd step in, take back control, remind everyone why she was the authority in the room. Daniel could refuse. He didn't owe her this. But the way the students were watching him, some curious, some expectant, waiting to see if he'd back down, made the decision for him. He stood up. Cartwright's smirk wavered. Just for a second. Daniel walked to the front. She handed him the textbook. He didn't even look at it. He had already memorized the problem. Without a word, he picked up the chalk. He knew her game. She had pulled this trick before, but she had miscalculated. Because Daniel lived for problems like this. He started writing. His movements were controlled, deliberate. The problem was tough. No question about it. But tough didn't mean impossible. As he worked, the whispers in the room faded. The only sound was the chalk against the board. He didn't rush, didn't hesitate. Each step unfolded naturally, every simplification, every transformation, leading to the inevitable answer. And then he boxed the final result, turned, faced the class. Silence. Cartwright's face was blank, but Daniel saw it, the clenched jaw, the stiff shoulders. She thought this would put him in his place. Instead, she had just made herself look like a fool. A student in the back let out a low laugh. "Yo, what?" Even the skeptical students were staring at Daniel, differently now. Cartwright's fingers twitched slightly at her side. She had to say something. She had to take back control. "You've skipped a step," she said. Her voice clipped. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "No, I didn't." Her fingers curled. "Yes, you did." Daniel turned back to the board, scanned his own work, then, without missing a beat, he pointed at a section near the middle. "This step here, the partial fraction decomposition. That's what you're talking about." Cartwright didn't answer. He nodded. "I didn't skip it. I just did the calculation mentally. It was straightforward." The room was dead silent. Cartwright's face tightened. Daniel turned back to her. "But if you'd like, I can write it out." The way he said it, not cocky, not smug, just matter of fact. And that made it worse, because he wasn't trying to make her look bad. She was doing that to herself. Cartwright inhaled sharply. "Number that won't be necessary." She turned back to her desk, set the textbook down, harder than she needed to. Daniel could feel the shift. He had just turned the class against her, but she wasn't going to let it end here. Cartwright turned back to the class. Her face was composed. Her grip on the desk? Not so much. Daniel sat down, but he knew this wasn't over, because the way she stood there, her posture too stiff, her jaw too tight. She was already figuring out her next move. The class was still processing what had just happened. Some exchanged glances, others whispered in hushed voices. Then, a hand shot up from the second row. "Professor!" a student called out. It was Brian, one of Cartwright's favorites. He leaned forward. If he got it right, doesn't that mean Daniel just solved a graduate-level problem? Shouldn't that, mean something? The room stilled. Cartwright's lips pressed into a thin line. Brian wasn't wrong, but admitting that would mean acknowledging she had underestimated Daniel. Her voice was smooth, controlled. "I never said it was impossible," she replied. "Only that it would be difficult for an undergraduate." There was something slippery about the way she said it, like she was already trying to rewrite what had happened. Daniel let out a slow breath. He wasn't looking for validation. He didn't need her approval. But the class? They needed to see what was happening here. Another student raised a hand. So, if he got it right, shouldn't he be in a more advanced class? Cartwright didn't answer right away. She glanced at Daniel, and for the first time, there was something else in her eyes. A calculation. Then, finally, she smiled. "I think," she said, her voice suddenly softer, "Mr. Reed would benefit from an academic challenge." A few students perked up. Was this it? Was she actually acknowledging his talent? Was she about to suggest a higher-level placement? Daniel wasn't convinced, and he was right not to be, because Cartwright continued, "I'd like to invite him to a little competition." Murmurs spread through the room. Daniel frowned. What kind of competition? Cartwright walked to her desk, pulled out a folder and flipped it open. "There's a university-sponsored mathematics symposium next month." She scanned the papers inside, then looked up. Some of the best students from different schools will be competing. It's a rigorous, high-pressure environment. A pause. Not just about solving problems, but doing it under time constraints, with an audience, her eyes locked onto his. I assume you'd be up for it. Daniel immediately saw what she was doing. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a setup. She wasn't just testing his math skills. She was testing his composure. Could he perform outside the safety of a classroom? Could he handle the pressure? Because if he failed, it wouldn't just be in front of his classmates. It would be in front of professors, graduate students, some of the best minds in the field. He could feel the weight of the room. Everyone was waiting. If he backed down now, it would look like he had gotten lucky today, that he wasn't actually as good as he seemed. And if he accepted, he'd have to win. Daniel exhaled, then nodded. I'm in. Cartwright's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Excellent. But she wasn't finished with him yet. The news spread fast. By the time Daniel stepped out of the lecture hall, the whispers had already started. In the hallways, in the library, at the dining hall. Did you hear? Reed's competing in the symposium. Dude, Cartwright's sending him to war. Think he's got a shot. Some nodded at him with newfound respect. Others looked at him like an athlete about to step into the championship game. Curious, expectant, waiting to see if he'd live up to the hype. Daniel barely paid attention. He had bigger things to focus on. That night, he sat in the campus library, surrounded by textbooks, notebooks filled with calculations, a half-empty coffee cup that had long gone cold. He had always loved math. But this wasn't just about numbers anymore. This was personal. A familiar voice broke the silence. Burning the midnight oil already? Daniel looked up. Brian, hands in his pockets, a smirk on his face. Daniel shrugged. Gotta be ready. Brian pulled out a chair, sat across from him. Dude, you're already ahead of half the people who compete in these things. A pause. Cartwright's just pissed that you embarrassed her. He leaned back. That's the only reason she threw you into this. Daniel sighed. I know. Brian studied him for a second. So, why do it? Daniel had asked himself the same thing. He didn't need to prove anything. He could have walked away, let the moment pass. But he knew how people like Cartwright worked. If he backed down, she'd make sure that's what people remembered. He's talented, but not disciplined enough. Intelligent, but not ready for real challenges. She would own the narrative, unless he took it from her. Daniel leaned forward, because she expects me to lose. A pause. And I want her to be wrong. Brian grinned. Now that I can respect. 4 weeks later. Daniel stood in a large auditorium-style lecture hall at the University of Pennsylvania. Rows of competitors, panels of judges, a massive digital timer glowing above the stage. Each desk stocked with scratch paper, pens, and one simple directive. Solve the problems, faster and more accurately than everyone else. And in the audience, Professor Cartwright. She hadn't spoken to him much leading up to this. No encouragement, no advice. Just a polite nod when they arrived, like she was just an observer. Not the person who had thrown him into this. But Daniel knew. She wasn't here to cheer him on. She was here to see if he'd crack. The timer started. He didn't. The competition began. The first round, mental math. Solve the problems. No writing, no second chances. Some competitors hesitated. Not Daniel. His hands moved without pause, punching numbers into the response system faster than the proctors could verify them. Every answer immediate, precise, unshaken. The second round, breaking down concepts into proofs. For Daniel, numbers weren't just numbers, they were patterns, rhythms, structures that built upon one another. He wasn't just solving equations. He was reading the language of logic itself. Then came speed solving, the round where most competitors cracked. The pressure made even the best students second-guess themselves. One mistake, one hesitation, and it was over. But Daniel, he thrived under pressure. His name crept higher, and higher, and higher. No one could deny it now. He wasn't just competing, he was dominating. And then, the final round. 2 competitors left, Daniel Reed and an MIT PhD candidate. The last problem flashed onto the screen. It was brutal. Layers of integrals, nested within summations. A test of not just intelligence, but endurance. Daniel's pulse steadied. He exhaled, picked up his pen, and started writing. But what happened next, no one saw coming. The clock ticked down, final seconds stretched like an eternity. Daniel's fingers gripped the pen, his mind running through the layers of the problem faster than he could write. Every part had to be perfect. No shortcuts, no mistakes. He could hear the faint scribbling beside him, his competitor, just as determined, neck and neck, each racing to finish first. Daniel's heart pounded, but his thoughts clear. And then he saw it, the shortcut no one else would see. That was it. His hand moved faster, slashing through numbers, simplifying expressions in ways most students wouldn't even think of. He didn't need to double-check. He knew. The final answer, boxed it, set his pen down. The timer buzzed. Daniel looked up, his breathing steady. His competitor still writing. The room was dead silent. One of the judges stood, walked over, examined both answers. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, after a long pause, the judge raised his microphone. The winner of the 2025 University Mathematics Symposium is Daniel Reed. The room erupted. Some students clapped, some gasped. But Daniel, he just exhaled, letting the reality sink in. He had won, not just against the other students, not just against the PhD candidate, but against the expectations placed on him, against the professor who had doubted him, against the unspoken assumptions that had tried to define him. Now, he defined himself. Professor Cartwright was motionless in the crowd. For the first time, Daniel met her gaze. She looked unsure, like she was reassessing everything she thought she knew. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't scowling either. Then, a slow, almost imperceptible nod. That was all. Daniel didn't need an apology. He didn't need validation. He had let the numbers speak for themselves. The next morning, Daniel walked into class, took his usual seat. Professor Cartwright entered a few minutes later. Composed, unshaken. But this time, when she scanned the room, her gaze landed on him differently, with respect. She cleared her throat. "Before we begin today's lecture," she said, voice even, "I'd like to acknowledge the results of yesterday's symposium." A pause. Daniel Reed took first place in a competition against some of the best mathematical minds in the country. Her voice remained steady. But beneath the surface, something softer. That is no small achievement. A few students clapped. Brian shot Daniel a knowing grin. Cartwright turned back to the board. And with that said, let's begin. That was it. No over-the-top praise. No long speech, just acknowledgement. And somehow, that meant more than anything else. Because Daniel hadn't needed to prove himself to her. He had needed to prove something to himself, and he had. Because sometimes, the best way to change people's minds isn't through words. It's through undeniable truth